Some decisions change everything in a single breath. Dalton never imagined that saying yes to a dying child's thirst would lead to a woman touching his face and saying words that would haunt him forever. The Apache woman stood before him in the merciless sun, her hand trembling as it reached toward his cheek, and what came from her lips wasn't a plea for help or gratitude for the water he'd given. It was a choice that made no sense, a declaration that turned his quiet, broken life into something he couldn't understand. And the strange part? She wasn't asking. She was deciding. For both of them. 3 days earlier, Dalton had been checking the fence line on the eastern edge of his property when he saw the tracks. 2 sets of footprints, one adult and one small, dragging through the dust like whoever made them was barely holding on. He'd learned to ignore strange signs out here. Ignoring things kept you alive, kept you from trouble. But these tracks led straight toward the dried creek bed where nothing lived anymore. And something about that felt wrong in a way he couldn't shake. He found them an hour later, collapsed in the shade of a dead cottonwood. The woman's eyes snapped open the second his shadow fell across her, and her hand moved to a blade at her waist faster than he could blink. But she didn't pull it, just held it there, watching him with the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than sleep could ever fix. Next to her, a little girl lay motionless, her lips cracked and bleeding, her chest rising and falling too fast. Dalton raised both hands slowly. He'd seen enough desperate people to know what happened when you move too quick. The woman's grip on the blade tightened, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the child made a sound, a weak, broken whimper that cut through the silence like a cry for help that couldn't quite form words. "Water," Dalton said quietly, nodding toward the canteen on his belt. "That's all? Just water." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she didn't stop him when he crouched down and uncapped the canteen. He held it out, not to her, but toward the child. It was a gamble. Trust had to start somewhere, even if it got you hurt. The woman stared at the canteen like it might be poison, then at him like she was deciding whether to let him live or not. Finally, she snatched it from his hand and pressed it to the child's lips. The little girl drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin, and the woman's shoulders sagged just slightly, like she'd been holding up the weight of the sky and could finally let it drop for just a second. When the canteen was empty, she handed it back without a word, her eyes still fixed on him with that same unreadable intensity. "There's more at the house," Dalton said, standing slowly. "And shade. Real shade." The woman didn't respond. She just gathered the child into her arms and stood, swaying slightly, and Dalton realized she wasn't much better off than the girl. He started walking back toward his property, not checking to see if she followed. If she didn't, that was her choice. But if she did, he'd have to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with 2 strangers who looked like they'd been running from something worse than thirst. Behind him, he heard footsteps in the dust. Slow, unsteady, but following. The walk to the house took longer than it should have. The woman kept stopping, adjusting the child in her arms, her legs threatening to give out with every few steps. Dalton wanted to offer to carry the girl himself, but he knew better. Trust wasn't something you rushed, especially not with someone who'd already pulled a blade on you once. So he walked ahead, slow enough that she could keep pace, and pretended not to notice when she stumbled. His house sat in a shallow valley, tucked against a rock face that provided shade in the afternoon. It wasn't much, just weathered wood and a roof that leaked when the rare rains came, but it had walls and a well that still gave water. The woman stopped at the edge of his property line, staring at the house like it might be a trap. Her eyes scanned every window, every shadow, looking for something he couldn't see. "Nobody else here," Dalton said, not turning around. "Just me." She didn't move. The child stirred in her arms, making that same broken sound again, and that seemed to decide it for her. She crossed the threshold onto his land, but her hand never left the blade at her waist. Inside, the house was dark and cooler than the brutal heat outside. Dalton gestured toward the bed in the corner, the only one he had, and the woman laid the child down carefully, brushing matted hair from the girl's forehead. Her fever was worse now. Dalton could see it in the flush of her skin, the way her small body trembled even in the shade. He brought more water, a cloth, and the last of the salt he kept for preserving meat. The woman watched him mix the salt into the water, her eyes sharp and suspicious, like she was waiting for him to add something else. Poison, maybe, or something worse. When he held the cup toward her, she took it but didn't drink. Instead, she tasted it first, just a sip, waiting to see if anything happened. "It's just salt water," Dalton said quietly. Helps with the fever. The woman didn't respond. She pressed the cup to the child's lips, coaxing her to drink in small sips, and for the first time since he'd found them, something in her expression softened. Not much. Just enough to show that underneath all that suspicion and anger there was fear. The kind of fear that came from watching someone you loved slip away and not being able to stop it. Dalton stepped back, giving them space. He busied himself at the stove, building a small fire to boil more water. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until the woman finally spoke. Why? He glanced over his shoulder. Why what? Why help us? Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in days. Your people don't help mine. Dalton turned back to the fire. He didn't have a good answer for that. Maybe because he knew what it felt like to watch someone die and be powerless to stop it. Maybe because he'd been alone so long that he'd forgotten what it meant to turn someone away. Or maybe because the alternative, walking past them and pretending he hadn't seen, felt like a worse kind of death than the one he'd already lived through. Because she's a child, he said finally, and children shouldn't die for things they didn't do. The woman studied him for a long moment, and he felt the weight of her gaze like something physical. She was measuring him, trying to figure out if he meant it, or if this was some kind of game. He kept his back to her, feeding the fire, letting her decide. My name is Kiona, she said quietly. He nodded. Dalton. Another silence. Then, softer, almost too quiet to hear. Her name is Ayanna. Dalton turned, and for the first time Kiona wasn't looking at him with suspicion. She was looking at her daughter, and the fear in her eyes was so raw it made his chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, in the days after his wife died, and he realized he was going to have to keep living anyway. She'll be all right, he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Kiona didn't respond. She just pressed her hand to Ayanna's forehead, her lips moving in words he couldn't hear. And Dalton wondered, not for the first time that day, what kind of desperation drove someone to trust a stranger when every instinct told them not to. By nightfall, Ayanna's fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had gotten worse. Dalton didn't sleep. He sat in the chair beside the bed, changing the cloth on Ayanna's forehead every few minutes, watching the rise and fall of her small chest like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Kiona had finally collapsed near the window, exhaustion winning over her need to stay alert. But even in sleep, her hand rested on the blade at her side. The fever burned through the child like wildfire. Ayanna's skin was so hot it hurt to touch, and every breath she took sounded wet and labored. Dalton had seen this before, in the winter after his wife died, when sickness swept through the territory and took half the children in the nearest settlement. He knew how it ended if the fever didn't break by morning. He pressed the cool cloth to her neck, her wrists, behind her knees, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. His hands moved with a gentleness that felt strange after so many years of working alone, of touching nothing softer than leather and wood. The girl stirred once, her eyes opening just slightly, unfocused and glassy. Mama, she whispered, the word barely forming. She's right there, Dalton said quietly, nodding toward Kiona. She's resting. You rest too. Ayanna's eyes closed again, and Dalton felt something crack in his chest. He'd forgotten how fragile children were, how much space they took up in a room despite their size, how their breathing became the only sound you could hear. Near dawn, Kiona woke. She sat up fast, her hand moving to the blade, her eyes searching the room until they found Ayanna. When she saw Dalton still sitting there, still changing the cloth, still keeping watch, something in her expression shifted. The suspicion didn't disappear entirely, but it softened around the edges. You've been awake all night, she said. It wasn't a question. Fever's bad, Dalton replied, not looking away from Ayanna. Can't let it run wild. Kiona stood and crossed to the bed, pressing her hand to her daughter's forehead. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment Dalton thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just took the cloth from his hands and continued the work herself, her movements careful and practiced. They sat in silence for a while, both focused on the child between them until Kiona spoke again. Her father died 8 months ago, she said quietly. Hunting accident. Arrow went through his leg, got infected. He was dead in 5 days. Dalton nodded slowly. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. My father wanted me to marry his brother, Kiona continued, her voice flat. It's our way. The brother takes care of the widow and the child. Keeps the family together. She paused, wringing out the cloth. But he was cruel. I saw how he treated his first wife. I refused. That's why you're out here alone? They gave me 3 days to change my mind, Kiona said. When I didn't, they sent me away, said I was no longer part of the tribe, that Ayana and I would have to survive on our own. Her hand stilled on the cloth. I thought I could. I thought I was strong enough, but the desert doesn't care how strong you are. Dalton looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw what he'd missed before. The weight of someone who'd gambled everything on their own strength and lost. The exhaustion that came from carrying another life on your back when you could barely carry your own. You did what you thought was right, he said. Right doesn't feed a child, Kiona replied bitterly. Right doesn't stop a fever. She was right. And Dalton didn't have an answer for that either. They continued through the morning, taking turns with the cloth, forcing small sips of water past Ayana's cracked lips. The sun climbed higher, turning the house into an oven, and still the fever raged. Kiona's hands started to shake around midday, exhaustion and fear finally catching up with her, and Dalton had to take over again. You need to rest, he said. I can't. If you collapse, who takes care of her then? Kiona stared at him, and he could see her working through the logic, hating that he was right. Finally, reluctantly she moved to the chair, but her eyes never left Ayana. An hour later, the fever broke. It happened all at once. Ayana's skin cooled, her breathing evened out, and she fell into what looked like real sleep instead of the half-conscious struggle she'd been fighting all night. Kiona stood so fast the chair tipped over, her hands hovering over her daughter like she was afraid to touch her and break whatever spell had made this happen. She's going to be all right, Dalton said. And this time he meant it. Kiona turned to look at him, and what he saw in her eyes made him take a step back. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition, like she was seeing him for the first time and realizing something that changed everything. She crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat still radiating from her skin. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly, and pressed against his cheek. Her palm was rough from work, warm from the fever watch, and steady despite the shake. I choose you to be the father, Kiona said. Dalton's first instinct was to step back. His second was to ask if she'd lost her mind from exhaustion, but he did neither. He just stood there, frozen, with her hand still pressed against his cheek, and those words hanging in the air between them like something solid and unmovable. What? He finally managed. Kiona's hand dropped, but her eyes didn't leave his face. I choose you to be the father. For Ayana. For me. She said it like it was the most logical thing in the world. Like proposing to a stranger was something people did every day when their children recovered from fever. I don't understand. I have nothing, Kiona said, her voice steady despite the desperation underneath. No tribe, no family, no way to keep her safe. She gestured toward Ayana, still sleeping peacefully in the bed. You saved her life. You stayed awake all night for a child you don't know. That means something. That means I'm not a monster, Dalton said. It doesn't mean I'm ready to be a father. The word tasted strange in his mouth. Father. He'd thought he would be one once, years ago, when his wife was pregnant and they'd talked about names and what color to paint the small room off the bedroom. But that child had never taken a breath, and his wife had bled out before the doctor could arrive, and the word father had died with them both. You already are, Kiona said quietly. You just don't know it yet. Dalton turned away, running a hand through his hair. This was insane. He'd brought them water and shelter because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted to tie his life to theirs permanently. He'd learned his lesson about attachments, about caring for people who could be taken away in a single moment of bad luck. I can work, Kiona continued behind him. I can cook, sew, tend animals if you have them. I know plants, which ones heal and which ones harm. I can teach Ayana to do the same. We won't be a burden. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what? Dalton turned back to face her. What happens when you change your mind? When you realize you don't want to be stuck out here with some poor farmer who couldn't even keep his own wife alive? The words came out harder than he meant them to, edged with something bitter that he'd buried deep and thought he'd forgotten about. But Kiona didn't flinch. She just looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, What happens when you realize you can't do this? That you don't want the responsibility of someone else's child? That's different. Why? Because you're the one taking the risk? Kiona shook her head. I'm risking more than you are. If this doesn't work, I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. You can walk away anytime. I can't. She was right, and that made it worse somehow. Because if he said yes, he'd be the one with all the power in this arrangement. And power over people who had none was the kind of thing that corrupted even good intentions. He'd seen it happen. Hell, he'd watched his own father turn into something cruel and twisted after his mother died, using his authority over Dalton and his sister like a weapon to keep them in line. I won't force you, Kiona said, softer now. If you want us to leave when Ayana is strong enough, we'll go. I'll find another way. She paused. But I'm asking you to consider it. Not because I expect anything from you, but because I saw something in you last night that I haven't seen in a long time. Kindness without conditions. And that's worth more than you know. Dalton looked at Ayana, still sleeping, her small face finally peaceful instead of twisted with fever pain. Then he looked at Kiona, standing there with her spine straight and her chin up, despite the fact that she was asking for something most people wouldn't even consider offering. And he thought about the years he'd spent alone in this house, the silence that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore, the way days blurred together into a gray nothing, where the only thing that marked time was the seasons changing. If I say yes, he said slowly, it's not because I expect anything from you either. You're not some servant I'm taking in, and I'm not going to pretend this is something it's not. What is it? Then, survival, Dalton said, for all of us. I've been alone long enough to know that's no way to live, and you need safety, so maybe we help each other. But there have to be rules. Respect. Boundaries. Kiona nodded. I agree. You sleep in the bed with Ayana. I'll take the floor. Agreed. No one touches the other without permission. Agreed. And if either of us changes our mind, we talk about it. Honest. No running off in the night. No pretending everything's fine when it's not. Kiona extended her hand, and Dalton stared at it for a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, calloused from work and steady. It felt like sealing something more permanent than he'd intended, but he didn't let go. Then we have an arrangement, Kiona said, and Dalton wondered, not for the first time, if he'd just made the best decision of his life, or the biggest mistake. 3 days passed, and the house that had been silent for years started to fill with sounds Dalton had forgotten existed. The soft padding of small feet in the morning, the murmur of a woman's voice singing something in a language he didn't understand, the scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot, the rustle of fabric being mended, the quiet breathing of people who existed in the same space without needing to fill every silence with words. Ayana recovered faster than he'd expected. By the second day she was sitting up, watching him with wide, curious eyes that reminded him painfully of his wife. By the third, she was standing, wobbling slightly but determined, reaching for things just to prove she could. Kiona stayed close, always within arm's reach, but Dalton noticed she was watching him just as much as she watched her daughter. He'd started teaching Ayana simple words. Nothing formal, just pointing at objects and saying their names while they sat on the porch in the evening coolness. She repeated them with a slight accent that made ordinary words sound prettier than they had any right to be. Water, sky, home. That last one made Kiona look up sharply from where she was grinding corn, but she didn't say anything. The arrangement between them settled into something that felt almost natural. Kiona cooked with ingredients Dalton had been ignoring for months, turning dried meat and hard flour into meals that actually tasted like food instead of fuel. She worked without asking, mending the tears in his shirts that he'd gotten used to, organizing the chaos he'd let accumulate in corners. When he tried to tell her she didn't have to, she just looked at him with those unreadable eyes and said, I told you I wouldn't be a burden. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He didn't have a good answer. The truth was, he liked having her there, liked watching her move through his space with quiet efficiency, liked the way she hummed sometimes when she thought no one was listening. But saying that felt like crossing one of the boundaries they'd agreed on. So he kept quiet and let her work. There were moments, though, when the boundaries felt thin, like when she reached past him to grab something from the shelf, and her arm brushed against his, the brief contact sending heat through his shirt, or when he helped her carry water from the well, and their hands touched on the bucket handle, and neither of them moved away as quickly as they should have. Once, he caught her watching him while he worked on fixing the fence, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that had nothing to do with their arrangement, and everything to do with the awareness that they were a man and a woman sharing close quarters. He'd look away first, always, because acknowledging it felt dangerous. On the fourth morning, Dalton was showing Ayanna how to feed the chickens when he heard Kiona call his name. Not loud, but with an edge that made him straighten immediately. He told Ayanna to stay put and walked back to the house. Kiona stood at the window, her body tense, staring out toward the eastern hills. "Someone's coming," she said quietly. Dalton moved beside her and followed her gaze. 3 riders, still distant but heading straight toward the house. Even from here, he could tell they weren't settlers. They moved differently, sat their horses differently, and the way Kiona's hand had gone to her blade told him everything he needed to know. "Your tribe?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice had gone flat, emptied of the warmth that had started creeping in over the past few days. "They've come for me." "What do they want?" Kiona's jaw tightened. "To bring me back. To make me fulfill the marriage. And if I refuse again." She didn't finish the sentence, but Dalton heard what she didn't say. If she refused again, they wouldn't just send her away. They'd take Ayanna, force Kiona into compliance by threatening the only thing she had left to care about. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less. Dalton looked at her, then at Ayanna playing with the chickens, oblivious to the danger riding toward them. He thought about the arrangement they'd made, about boundaries and respect, and how none of that mattered if Kiona and her daughter weren't safe. He thought about the years he'd spent avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, not getting involved in things that weren't his problem, and he thought about how much he'd come to hate that person he'd become. "Get Ayanna inside," he said, "and stay away from the windows." Kiona grabbed his arm, her fingers tight. "Dalton, you don't understand. These men, they won't just leave because you ask them to. I know. They'll fight if they have to. Then we'll handle it." He met her eyes, and something in his expression must have convinced her, because she nodded once and went to get Ayanna. Dalton walked to the corner of the room and pulled his old rifle from where it had been gathering dust for the past year. He checked the chamber, loaded it, and moved to the doorway to wait. The riders were closer now, close enough to see their faces, and Dalton realized, with something close to certainty, that the next hour would decide whether his arrangement with Kiona survived or ended in violence. The 3 riders stopped 50 paces from the house. They sat their horses with the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence, like men who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start hearing it now. The one in the center was older, maybe 40, with scars running down his left arm and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. The other 2 were younger, broader, with the kind of build that came from a lifetime of physical work. Dalton stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loose but ready. He didn't point it at anyone. Not yet. That would be a declaration, and declarations had a way of turning conversations into violence faster than necessary. "This is private land," Dalton said, his voice carrying across the distance. "State your business or move on." The man in the center swung down from his horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "We're here for the woman and child, Kiona. She belongs to our tribe. People don't belong to anyone. Our ways are not your ways." The man took a step forward. She was given a choice. She made the wrong one. Now she must face the consequences. "Looks to me like she made her choice and you didn't like it," Dalton said. "That's not the same as making the wrong one." The man's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "You don't understand what's at stake here. This is about honor, about family obligation. She has responsibilities she's trying to avoid. Her responsibility is to that little girl inside," Dalton said. "Everything else comes second. The child needs a father, a proper father from her own people, not some stranger who takes in strays because he's lonely." The words hit harder than Dalton wanted to admit, but he didn't let it show on his face. "That girl has a father now, me, and unless Kiona tells me different, neither of them are going anywhere." The man studied him for a long moment, and Dalton could see him measuring, calculating how far he could push before this turned into something that couldn't be walked back. Finally, he turned slightly and called out toward the house. "Kiona, come out. Let's talk like reasonable people." The door opened, and Kiona emerged. She'd left Ayanna inside, and Dalton could see the fear in her eyes even though she kept her spine straight and her chin up. She positioned herself beside Dalton, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and faced the 3 men. "Dakota," she said, and Dalton heard the history and how she said the name. This wasn't just any warrior. This was the man her father had wanted her to marry. You've caused enough trouble, Dakota said. It's time to end this foolishness and come home. Your daughter needs stability. She needs to grow up among her people, learning our ways. She needs safety, Kiona replied. And I won't find that with you. I've never raised a hand to a woman. Your first wife would say different if she could speak from her grave. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. One of the younger warriors shifted uncomfortably on his horse, and Dalton realized that whatever Kiona was talking about, it wasn't just rumor. These men knew the truth of it. Dakota's expression darkened. You have no proof of that, and you insult me by speaking lies to this stranger. I saw the bruises, Kiona said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I helped her hide them. So don't stand there and tell me you've never hurt anyone when we both know what you're capable of. Dakota took another step forward, and Dalton raised the rifle just slightly, enough to make his intention clear. The warrior stopped, his eyes moving from Kiona to Dalton and back again. So this is your choice? Dakota asked. You'd rather live with a white man than return to your people? You'd let your daughter grow up outside our traditions, never knowing who she really is? I'd rather let her grow up alive, Kiona said, with someone who treats her like she matters instead of like property to be traded. The council won't accept this. Your father won't accept it. My father stopped being my father when he tried to sell me to a man who beats women. The words were like a slap, and Dakota's hand moved to the blade at his side. The two younger warriors tensed, ready to follow his lead. Dalton's finger moved to the trigger, and he felt that familiar cold clarity that came before violence. The way time seemed to slow down and every detail became sharp and immediate. You need to leave, Dalton said quietly. Now, before this becomes something none of us can take back. Dakota stared at him, and Dalton could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. 3 against 1. But the one had a rifle and higher ground, and the 3 would have to charge across open space to reach him. It wouldn't be clean. Someone would die, maybe more than one person, and there was no guarantee it would be the man with the gun. This isn't over, Dakota said finally. The council will decide what happens next, and when they do, you'll have to answer for taking what doesn't belong to you. She's not a thing to be taken, Dalton replied. And I won't answer to anyone about giving shelter to people who need it. Dakota mounted his horse, the movement stiff with suppressed rage. The 3 of them turned and rode back toward the hills, but Dalton didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight. Even then, he kept it close. Kiona stood beside him, and when he finally looked at her, he saw that she was shaking. Dalton didn't lower the rifle until the riders had disappeared completely over the eastern ridge. Even then, he held it for another few minutes, watching the horizon like they might reappear at any moment. Beside him, Kiona had finally stopped shaking, but her breathing was still too fast, too shallow. You should sit down, Dalton said, turning toward her. I need to check on Ayana. She's fine. She's inside where it's safe. You, on the other hand, look like you're about to collapse. Kiona didn't argue. She let him guide her to the chair on the porch, and she sank into it like her legs had been holding her up through sheer will and nothing else. Dalton leaned the rifle against the wall and crouched in front of her, close enough to see the tear tracks on her face that she'd been too proud to let fall while Dakota was watching. You did good, he said quietly, standing up to him like that. I've condemned us, Kiona whispered. When the council decides, they'll send more than 3 men, and they won't come to talk. Then we'll handle it when it happens. You don't understand. They won't just take me back. They'll punish you for interfering, for taking what they believe belongs to them. She looked at him, and the fear in her eyes was raw and unguarded. I've put you in danger. I should leave before it gets worse. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended, but he didn't soften it. Kiona blinked, surprised, and Dalton realized that somewhere in the past few days, his decision about this arrangement had stopped being about logic or survival and started being about something else entirely. I meant what I said out there, he continued. You're not going anywhere unless you choose to. And if your tribe has a problem with that, they can bring it to me directly. Why? Kiona asked, and the question held more weight than those 3 letters should have carried. Why would you risk everything for people you barely know? Dalton stood and moved to the edge of the porch, staring out at the land he'd worked alone for so long it had started to feel like a prison instead of a home. My wife, he said finally. Sarah. She died because I wasn't there when she needed me. Kiona didn't respond, just waited for him to continue. I was in town, trading for supplies. She went into labor early, and by the time I got back it was too late. The baby never took a breath, and Sarah bled out before I could even hold her hand. He paused, the memory sitting heavy in his chest like it always did. I spent years after that avoiding people, avoiding connections, because I figured if I didn't care about anyone, I couldn't fail them again. That's not failure, Kiona said softly. That's tragedy. You can't blame yourself for something you couldn't control, can I? Dalton turned to look at her. Because I've spent every day since wondering if things would have been different if I'd just stayed home that morning. If I'd ignored the supplies we needed and kept her close where I could protect her. And you'd have starved that winter without those supplies, Kiona said. Or gotten sick. Or any number of other things that would have made you useless when she actually needed you. She stood and crossed to where he was standing. You can't live your life preparing for every possible tragedy. Eventually, you're not living at all. Is that what you've been doing? Just surviving instead of living? Yes, Kiona admitted. Ever since my husband died. Every decision I made was about survival, about keeping Ayana breathing one more day. I stopped thinking about anything beyond that. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Until you. Until this. The space between them felt charged, like the air before lightning struck. Dalton could feel the heat radiating off her skin, could smell the faint scent of sage and smoke that clung to her hair. One step forward, and he could touch her. One word, and he could cross every boundary they'd established. But he didn't. Dakota said something that's been bothering me, Dalton said instead. He acted like there was more to this than just a refused marriage. Like there's something else at stake. Kiona's expression closed off immediately, and Dalton knew he'd hit something important. What is it? He pressed. What aren't you telling me? She turned away, her shoulders tense. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Dalton thought she might refuse to answer entirely. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, my husband wasn't killed in a hunting accident. Dalton went still. What? He was murdered, Kiona said, and the word hung between them like something physical. Dakota's younger brother did it, made it look like an accident with the arrow. But I knew. I saw them arguing the day before. Heard my husband refuse to give up our land rights to the family. She wrapped her arms around herself. But I couldn't prove it. And when I accused them, the council said I was grief-stricken and imagining things. That's why Dakota wants you back so badly, Dalton said, understanding clicking into place. If you're married to him, you can't testify against his brother. Kiona nodded. And my father supports it because Dakota promised him a position on the council in exchange for my hand. So this isn't about honor or tradition. No, Kiona said bitterly. It's about power and covering up a crime. It always has been. Dalton looked toward the eastern hills where the riders had disappeared, and something cold settled in his gut. This wasn't going to end with a council decision or a reasonable conversation. This was going to end with blood. The only question was whose. They came back 2 days later. Not 3 riders this time. 7. And they didn't stop 50 paces out. They rode straight up to the property line. And Dakota dismounted like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Dalton had been expecting them. He'd spent those 2 days preparing, reinforcing the doors, making sure the windows could be barred from inside, checking his ammunition supply. Kiona had wanted to run, to take Ayana and disappear into the desert before the confrontation came. But Dalton had convinced her that running would only delay the inevitable. Eventually, they'd be found. And next time, there might not be a house to shelter in or high ground to defend from. This time, when Dakota approached, he brought an older man with him, gray-haired, weathered, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. Kiona stiffened when she saw him. My father, she whispered. Dalton kept the rifle ready but didn't point it yet. You're not welcome here, he called out. I told you that last time. The older man spoke, his voice carrying authority that Dakota's hadn't. I am Apache, elder of our people. I've come to bring my daughter home and resolve this dishonor. There's no dishonor in choosing safety over obligation, Dalton replied. You don't understand our ways. I understand that your ways got a man murdered and his widow threatened for refusing to marry his killer's brother. The words landed like stones in still water. Several of the warriors shifted uncomfortably and Enape's expression darkened. But it was Dakota who reacted, his hand moving to his blade. You accuse me of... I accuse your brother, Kiona said, stepping forward before Dalton could stop her. I accuse him of murder, and I accuse you of protecting him, and I accuse our father of selling me to keep it hidden. Enape's face went rigid. You have no proof. I have truth, Kiona said. And witnesses. 2 of them. She pointed at the younger warriors who'd come with Dakota the first time. They were there. They saw the argument between my husband and your brother. They heard the threats. And they know the arrow that killed him wasn't placed by accident. The 2 men she'd pointed at looked at each other, then at the ground, and their silence was answer enough. Speak, Enape commanded. Is what she says true? The younger of the 2 warriors swallowed hard. We saw them arguing, but we didn't see. You saw enough, Kiona interrupted. You saw enough to know something was wrong, and you said nothing because you were afraid. Just like everyone else. The words hung in the air, and Dalton watched Enape's expression shift from anger to something more complicated. Doubt maybe, or recognition that his daughter wasn't going to back down this time. Even if this were true, Enape said carefully, you're still bound by tribal law. You can't simply walk away from your responsibilities. Watch me, Kiona said. I already have. And the child? She belongs with her people. She belongs with her mother, Dalton said, stepping beside Kiona. And her father. And that's me now, whether you accept it or not. Dakota laughed, harsh and bitter. You think claiming fatherhood changes anything? You think that makes you family? I think, Dalton said slowly, that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to care when it would be easier to walk away. He looked at Kiona, then back at Dakota. And I choose them. Every day. That's more than your brother did. More than you've done. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Enape turned to Dakota and said something in their language. Low and sharp. Dakota's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. The elder looked at Kiona one last time, and something in his eyes softened just slightly. You were always stubborn, he said quietly. Like your mother. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. The others followed, including Dakota, though he shot one last venomous look over his shoulder before disappearing over the ridge. When they were gone, Kiona's knees buckled. Dalton caught her before she hit the ground, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to tear her apart. He held her, feeling her tears soak into his shirt, and realized that somewhere in the past week, these 2 people had stopped being strangers and started being something else entirely. Thank you, Kiona whispered against his chest. You don't have to thank me for doing what's right. I wasn't thanking you for that. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes red but clear. I was thanking you for being the father I chose, the one Ayana deserves, the one I didn't know we needed until you were there. Behind them, the door opened, and Ayana peeked out. When she saw that the men were gone, she ran to them both, wrapping her small arms around their legs. Dalton reached down and picked her up, settling her against his hip like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe this is what family looked like when you stopped expecting it to follow rules and just let it become what it needed to be. Home? Ayana asked, looking between them. Kiona smiled through her tears and touched Dalton's face. The same gesture she'd made days ago when everything changed. Yes, she said softly. Home. And Dalton, who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what that word meant, finally understood that home wasn't a place. It was the people you chose to keep safe, the ones who chose you back. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another powerful frontier tale where unexpected choices change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us bring you more stories like this one. Your support means the world to us.